Hey, well, good morning. As I said a few minutes ago, we have a paucity of pupils here this morning. This is basically our last official Zoom meeting. We have no readings for next week. You have your two big assignments that are due. Now, I will send out an invite for next Tuesday for anybody who does want to log on, ask questions about the assignments and things of that nature. The civic engagement paper is due by turn it in no later than midnight on the 24th. Instructions are wolfed in on the completion and what needs to be done. I've had one of the students ask if I can review an outline for them. If I get that in sufficient time, I'll be more than happy to do that. But again, this has a civic engagement tag, so there's an expectation that you'll do that assignment as well. The final exam will be on the 26th. It'll be posted. It'll be basically 2 hours, from 9 to 11 on Friday, the 26th. You can open it at your leisure. Two things to remember, as we've talked about earlier with the written assignments. You're required at the end to put an honor statement that basically said, I didn't lie, cheat, steal, use the work of others in preparing this paper. Failure to add that is a one-letter grade reduction in the grade for the paper. One of the good news, bad news issues about having you do that is it's a reminder that at this level, your work has to be your own. This is your time to develop your critical thinking skills and develop your awareness and understanding of the topics we're talking about. So to use the work of others and not claim it. You notice in the news, the president of Harvard University was forced to retire or resign because of plagiarism in work that she had done. And prior to that time, the president of the University of South Carolina was resigned because of plagiarism in a speech that was given. So that's one of the major faux pas, if you will, in any work, but especially at the college level, is taking credit for the work of others. So please take that seriously. If you have issues being able to meet the time frame on that Friday the 26th from 9 to 11 Eastern time, please email and let me know beforehand so we can make adjustments as necessary to meet your needs. If I don't hear from you, there'll be no reason for me to change for anybody in particular. So we'll go from there. Discussion forums, the first 2 weeks have been reviewed and graded. We still have the same problem. First, we need to keep in mind that the assignment has two components. One is your post, and the second is you're responding to someone else's post. So we have several of you that have done your own post but didn't respond to anybody else's. Part of it may be timing in terms of things get done, but you can always log back in if there's no one else to respond to when you post yours. The original posts are getting a little bit better, still lacking in detail. Again, this is supposed to be a substitute or a comparison to in-class discussion on the issues and topics being talked about during that week's programs. So I expect a bit more detail in your original response. Some of you have gotten a bit better, and I was pleased with some of the improvement. Others are just doing the minimal accepted, and that's fine, but that's not going to be a very strong grade. Remember, the way I grade my courses, everybody starts off with a 0, and you earn points for what you do. So at least turning in something will get you a few points. The responses, as I mentioned last time, are incredibly inadequate. Yes, I agree, good deal, yeah, I like it, are not acceptable responses when you're supposed to be saying why you like it. For those of you that may take my classes in the future, I do not grade based on your opinion. I do grade, however, based on your ability to defend that opinion. And just saying you like something is no excuse for not having more detail as we go forward. So again, they've been posted. You have one more opportunity to demonstrate your competency in the area. But again, keep those in mind as we go forward. Now, hopefully the PowerPoints help to guide for your reading for this week. and as we move forward on the discussion to go on. Again, there will be no assignment for a Zoom meeting next week. I will be sending out an invite. It's completely optional. And the requirement or expectation there is that if you need questions and have issues, we need to make sure we're in good shape. So again, if you have questions, please let me know.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
I know you said that the discussion boards have been graded. On Wolfton, I can't see any grades, so I just did not know if that's because they haven't been submitted or.
When did you log in? This morning?
I looked this morning, and I know after last Zoom call when you said that they were graded, I looked after that too, and that it was not on there either.
Okay, well, how about checking again? Because I've entered them all, and they should be saved in the coursework assignment for discussion 1, discussion 2. They will not be graded in discussion forum, but they will be graded in coursework.
All right, let me take a look.
So check that out. They should be in good shape. And if not, I'll go back and after class check them because they've all been graded and posted.
Yeah, there's nothing.
There is nothing. Okay, I'll go back and check that out after class because they should all be up there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll look into that right after class, and I will send out an email if there's any issue related to it.
All right,
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for letting me know. The session for the readings this week, I know I posted 4 PowerPoints, and we have more company joining us.
Oh yeah.
And those are kind of the ultimate expression of our participation in the process of government. We talked about parties and interest groups. We talked about public opinion, elections, and then the media. And all of those are ways that we get actively involved in the process of governance. And that gets to be critically important as what we go on. Several things are involved. First, parties and interest groups. As we've talked about briefly last time and in our discussions, political parties are in fact interest groups. But the big difference between a political party and an interest group is that political parties are tasked with getting people elected to office. Interest groups may support a candidate, may work for a candidate, but they do not nominate and put people on the ballot. So that's the main difference between the two. In political parties, we just had the caucuses in Iowa yesterday is the beginning of the election cycle. South Carolina's first in the South primary will be coming up in February. And so we're full blown on the election cycle. So parties will be directly involved in that. And what they do is they identify, recruit, train, support either financially or through other material ways to help them get elected. And once they get elected, they're to support their constituencies and the people that elected them. The problem, of course, is that elections become closer and closer when there's a 1 or 2 percentage point difference. Who represents the large percentage of folks that didn't support that candidate? Who looks after their issues and interests? It gets to be important to do. The founding fathers never anticipated the idea of parties. We had factions, which were somewhat unorganized interests. And as we said in previous discussions, early colonial period, there were 2 main ones. There was the industrial and manufacturing North and the agricultural South. And these factions competed, and we saw in our discussion of the Constitution over representation, whether it's based on population, equality, things of that nature. And so that issue carried on. George Washington, in his farewell address, cautioned about political parties being formed formally, and that what they potentially would do is be motivated by personality. You could have a small minority of folks in elected positions dominating the entire process. And in some ways, that's what we have going on today. When we look at what's happening within Congress, especially with the House of Representatives, with the challenges they've had lately in getting a Speaker of the House elected, the number of votes you had to take to make those things happen. So that's going to be the interesting part coming forward, especially now that we're in the elections cycle that we're at. So parties you basically have the parties in power, and then you have parties in the community. And the basic difference between the two, and your text goes into greater detail, is that parties in government are the parties as they're functioning as government entities in the House and the Senate, at the presidency, and at the state level. From election point of view, most county governments will be a partisan election, or as they run by political party, but most of the organizations below that level run nonpartisan. So city councils, school boards, other boards and commissions that are elected are nonpartisan. Counties and above tend to be partisan. And so what you have is you have the party level at the county to support county level issues and also to educate and inform the public. You have state level organizations whose job is to run the state nominating process, run a state convention, and again, provide material support and financial support to candidates once they've been selected. And then we have the national party, which then takes it at the national level and getting people nominated for president and moving on from there. One of the things that we found, and we've talked about this before, is a change that happened with the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission case that basically decided that money was speech. And so people could spend as much of their own money as they wanted supporting a candidate or an issue. The only caveat was that they couldn't have direct connection to the candidate. So you see all these political action committees having advertisements and things of that supporting either a candidate or a position. And then at the end, they'll say this is paid for, give the name of the political action committee. They have very few limits on the amount of money they can raise. There are limitations on their requirement to release names of people who contribute to their political action committee. They've changed the dynamic so that we've gone from everybody basically having somewhat equal access to now with Citizens United, giving those with lots of money a much louder megaphone to be heard, to get their message across. And it's really changed the dynamic. And so the cost of running for election has increased significantly, as has the role of outside action committees. And at the national level, all this is done is to limit the impact of the party. Candidates have to have, because we're a two-party system, except for the occasional third party at the national level, run either the Republican or Democrat. And in years past, there used to be more control by the parties over what they were done. And then we had federal support to help people run for office. But now what candidates have the ability to do is collect money on their own. President Obama was the first to make great advantage of it. And then former President Trump has been a mastermind in generating funds using social media, not only for his campaign, but his political actions committees that support him have been equally successful. So those are the challenges we have coming on with the role of money. Your text talks about the evolution of parties and how they've changed from the original era where they were simply interests during the colonial period, factions as we call them, to starting in 1820s with Mark Van Buren to the growth of parties and how they've meandered back and forth. One of the most important things to think about with parties when it comes in elections is we have in this country something called a winner take all. So whoever wins a state wins the votes and the number of electoral votes in that state. Because of that, it tends to limit to two viable parties, two viable candidates. And that's another reason why we don't have a lot of third-party candidates, is their ability to generate money. The different states have different requirements for getting on the ballot, and all of those make it a bit more difficult to run. After every presidential election, there's a big debate on what to do about the Electoral College. If you remember back January 6th, when they had the incidents at the Capitol building, depending who you talk to, it was an attempt to overthrow the government. And on another point, it was just citizens expressing their right to protest. The jury is still out on what that was, an insurrection or just public protest. But the issue around that was certifying the Electoral College ballots. And the Electoral College started out in the early days when the president was elected by the Senate as a way to get away from having factions and popularity contests and the cult of personality. And it's kind of stuck with us. In the Electoral College, basically, each state has Electoral College votes based on 2 senators and the number of elected representatives they have. So larger states, California, Texas, New York, Michigan, have significant number of electoral votes, and smaller jurisdictions may have as few as 3. So that changes the way the campaign gets done because you're going to spend your resources where you get the maximum return. And the Electoral College system tends to benefit smaller rural states because you can go in, spend your money on smaller rural states and get electoral votes that surpass what are in one state such as California, where in California you received a lot more votes. So that always becomes a debate whether we should go by the Electoral College or by popular vote. The challenge there, if we go to a popular vote, that then supports the larger, gives the more metropolitan, urbanized states an advantage. So there's no perfect answer on how to deal with it. It's debated all the time, but it changes the way that we campaign. South Carolina has been a very solid Republican state since the mid-1970s. So it's unlikely that President Trump will make more than, or excuse me, candidates, especially President Trump, or former President Trump, will spend a whole lot of time in the state because it's pretty much a lock for the Republican. The same will be true if you have either of the other 2 candidates that will somehow make a run, either DeSantis, who in fact finished second in Iowa, or Nikki Haley, who finished third, a few fractions of a percent difference in the 2 of them. So that'll make a difference in the way we campaign. The primary, South Carolina is the first in the South, and it's actually now the first in the nation for an actual primary vote. And one of the reasons that they're doing that and change that is that in Iowa and in New Hampshire, they tend to be much less diverse in the population than is South Carolina. So in both Iowa and in New Hampshire, where the first 2 votes traditionally have taken place, there are very, very, very small percentage of minority living in either state. So the argument is that's not really a good test of a candidate's strength across the board. So South Carolina, now being first in the state primary, thinks will make a difference, and the argument is it makes a more representative look at who supports what and goes on from there. So the whole strategy involved with campaigning, where you're going to spend your time. Alaska has very few electoral votes. It's unlikely that the major candidates will go to Alaska. They will have the surrogates go there. But that's not necessarily. That's why we end up with these swing states that we saw were so prevalent in the last presidential election: Georgia, Florida, Michigan, New York, and a few others where it was in debate. Ohio, where it wasn't a clear sense of whether they were Democrat or Republican. And so that's where you see the big battlegrounds taking place, is in those states that are not clearly traditionally supporting one party or the other. So that's the interesting thing to watch as we move forward with the campaigns coming on. You'll find out the challenges of running a campaign. Money has ceased to be a problem, especially after the primary season is done, because during the primaries, neither party will actively provide financial support to any of the candidates running for the nomination. And the reason being is a party cannot take sides early on in the election. They have to wait until the party has its nominee and then jump in full force to support the nominee. Interest groups, on the other hand, support interest. The people to gather together, whether it's a National Rifle Association or Wildlife Association or Ducks Unlimited, whatever it might be, labor unions, business groups. And these are folks that are joined together for the purpose of furthering the interests that they share in common. Some people are more active members, others just show up and donate money, but they all play a role. And when we talked about our sense of our overall arching themes, this is back to the willingness of the government to listen and the authority that people have to petition government for redress of injuries. That's what interest groups are doing. They're petitioning government to take action that's more favorable to their interests or their cause. And your book goes into great detail on interest groups, how they're structured and what roles they play. But again, the key is they do not, in interest groups in general, do not nominate candidates for office and try to get them elected. That's the party. However, they can play an active role, because one of the things that candidates need to have is a strong support base. And that's one of the strengths former President Trump had in Iowa, had a very active group in the state of Iowa, out campaigning, knocking on doors, running telephone banks, much more use of social media. And so that boots on the ground gets to be a critical element as people run for office and want to get out the vote. You'll hear this oftentimes, the key to winning is one, getting more electoral college votes than the other, but it's also getting turnout, getting more of your people out to support you than your opponent can get out to support them. And that becomes a real issue, real challenge as we go forward to make those things happen. So parties and interest groups play an important role. The interest groups go back to our ability to petition government for redress of injuries. The parties are they were not really envisioned by the founding fathers. They were an evolution out of the 1820s and Martin Van Buren, and have played an increasing and changing role. And that's one of the big takeaways as you think about parties and the role they play. How is party structure changing? With a two-party system, oftentimes people are not voting for the best candidate, but for the least objectionable. I dislike this person less than I'll dislike the other person. And that gets to be a challenge. The other challenge we have is that newer generations are taking decreasing interest in the political process and running for office. How do we get the new generation of candidates out and running? As we've talked in other sessions, and I've talked with my colleagues, it's interesting that the two major candidates from the Democrat and the Republican Party are both nearly octogenarians. They're in their late 70s and their 80s. And while I'm not big on age discrimination, the reality is, are they being rewarded because they've been around so long? And how do they have a connection with people your age? What is going to be their stances on issues that are of concern to you and your generation when they're very much removed from that process? So again, pay particular attention as you go through. We'll talk about parties and interest groups. The PowerPoint's there to help guide you as you go forward. Gets to be important. The other issue that we've talked about, and it's in your reading, is the whole idea of public opinion. And the question is, what is public opinion? What is the public's opinion? And how do we gauge that? Traditionally, being back to the 1930s, we started this process of doing public opinion polling and trying to get the public's input. Prior to that time, it was straw polls, getting a sense, a very narrow focus on whose opinions were held. And so you develop this idea of survey research for public opinion. And early on, the problems they ran was getting an adequate sample. Several of the issues that are involved and you need to become aware of as you move through college is a whole idea of statistics, statistical evaluation and analysis, and what that means. And so when you design a public opinion poll and a survey, first you have to understand who you're trying to get information from. What age group, what sex, and what socioeconomic status, what political party. In the case of elections, you want to get people who are registered to vote and people who are likely to vote. And depending on which you get, whether you address people who voted last time or you just do a blanket to everybody who belongs to a party, that's still not going to get you all the people that you need because there are a lot of people who vote Republican or Democrat, but they're not officially join a party. Some of that you can get from prior elections to know how they voted in the primaries to move forward. But identifying who you're going to ask the questions gets to be very important. So that's known as a sample. Who are you going to ask? That's also known as a population of interest. So once you've decided what your sample is, then the question is, how do we get a random sample? Because the whole notion of statistical analysis is based on everybody in the sample having equal probability of being called or being contacted. One of the famous pictures that's in your text is Harry Truman holding up a newspaper saying, "Dewey defeats Truman." And that was kind of the ultimate wrongdoing. It was done by a very narrow sample of people that tended not to represent the population as a whole, and they got it wrong completely. So that emphasized the importance of knowing who you're asking. So you have your sample, then you make sure there's some kind of randomness so that everybody has an equal opportunity to be contacted. And it started out as being in person, then it went to mail, then it went to telephone. And then we had the evolution from telephone to cell phones, all of which created its own challenges. And now social media. And because people are less likely to want to sit on the phone and answer surveys, they're now setting up internet-based surveys to try to get random samples. So the page that's changing, and we have as a responsibility as citizens understand, who's doing what, who's being asked, who's being taught. And a friend of mine sent me a clip about the overwhelming majority of people that voted in the Iowa caucuses believe that President Biden is not legitimate. Well, that's fine, except who did they interview? Interview people that participated in the Republican caucus. So of course you're going to have high numbers. And so asking what happens. And so having some sense of who conducted the survey, when it was conducted, what the sample was, equal opportunity, that's the important stuff to do. And for statistical analysis, the thing we have to remember is telling the average of something is fine, but otherwise it's obviously meaningless. If one of you makes $90,000 a year and I make $10,000 a year, what's our average salary? $50,000. That doesn't reflect any truth of what the matter is. There are other measures that are better for that. So when you look at campaign, when you look at public opinion polls, it's important to know who conducted it, when was it conducted, how was the sample selected, what was the sample? Were they contacting from an election point of view people who voted in their last election, people who are registered to vote, anybody over the age of 18 who's eligible to register to vote? And depending on how you sample, you'll get different answers. And that's the important element of looking at all these campaigns. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the data is only as good as the time and how well it was collected. And so one of the things that's important to keep about with your statistics and numbers, which ties into this notion of public opinion, is the value of large numbers. And the most simple way to explain this is if you've ever been to a fair, to a meeting, to anything where they have a number of ping pong balls in a jar or candy corn in a jar or whatever it might be, and you ask people to guess. The more people that guess, when you add up all the guesses and take the average, the closer you come to the actual number that are in the jar. Earlier this or late last fall, we had a little way for people to get around campus and meet people. So I had a jar of candy corn and I counted the number of it, and we had people that came in and guessed. And the more people that guessed, the closer the average came to the actual number. And in my case, I had roughly 30 people signed up, and their average guess was within 10% of the actual number in the jar. The more data you get, the more valid data you get, the more close to the actual number you'll get. And so if you have from a national survey, 1,200 people, from a state level survey, 900 people, you can get fairly good estimates of what the actual numbers are. But again, it has to be conducted scientifically. One of the better ways to look at public opinion and surveys is just like a blood test. You can go to the doctor and have blood drawn, and it can give you a good picture of how you're doing. But it depends on whether using sterile needles. Was their equipment proper? Did they follow scientific method? And then you have to keep in mind that those are results are how you're doing that day at that time. If you go a week later and have blood work done, it may be different. And that's the way public opinion is. So in public opinion, we make a difference between public opinion polling and a thing called surveillance. And surveillance is where you ask the same questions over and over and over and over again over a long period of time. And you get some trend analysis of how the issues are. So again, you see a lot of use of that. And one of the good news about polls is that it works on the assumption people tell you the truth. The bad news about polls is people will lie to you. And there's a whole psychology of survey and response. There's a whole psychology of questioning and question ordering. So public opinion is not as simple as it sounds. And if it's going to be used as some kind of direct linkage between the public's opinion and the directions they want government to head, it's even more important it be done scientifically, that we have access to the data. And the problem is I can write a question to get the answer you want. And so simple ways they do that and unscientific would be, would it change your mind about candidate Smith if you know they beat their wife? I didn't say they did. Haven't accused them of doing it, but I planted a seed of doubt. Oh, there must be something to it, right? So those can get a off the wall subject. The way you ask a question makes a difference in the response that you get. And so if we're going to be informed consumers of public opinion data, we need to make sure we know where it comes from. And perhaps one of the most obvious uses of data for making predictions is the weather forecast. What does it mean when there's a 50% chance of rain? Does that mean there's a 50% chance that 100% of you will get rained on? No. What does it mean? And yet we plan our days. Look at the last couple of major storms that came through. One of the local standards had what alert days. It was going to be strong winds and heavy rains and getting ready for, man, very little of that happened. In the wintertime when they have predictions of snowstorms and we shut down schools and that prediction doesn't come through. That doesn't mean that the science is bad. It means we don't have enough data about how weather is formed and the way it impacts. So the more data we gather, the more accurate we get. So that's the whole thing about public opinion. Why is that important? Because one of the assumptions is that's the way for people to express their interest to the elected leaders and the policy leaders on what they prefer to get done. And if it's not done accurately, it can be very misleading. And so that's why a lot of people come to mistrust polls. And that was some of the debate in the last election, why the polling results were different than the actual election results. Well, because they're predictions. Most of them, if they're good, they'll have a plus or minus 3.5% margin of error, which means if it's a 51-49, it can be, a lot broader spread than that. If it's a 3% add and subtract 3.5%, and it makes all the difference in the world. That's why that's important. Where it would be interesting to follow through with the election coming up is some places doing surveillance, asking the same questions every week, every 2 weeks throughout the campaign, and look at the trend of which way things are going. It gets to be important to do that, and that's the element about it that's critical. So campaigns and elections, we've talked a good bit about those, and your text goes into great detail on them. And it talks about how it starts out from generating interest to getting people interested in running for office, to providing the skill sets. And one of the challenges that we have now with elections is negative campaigning. Not so much running on what I'm going to do, but how bad the other person is. And that makes a challenge when you go out to vote, because if you're the incumbent, you have a record on which to run. And so you're voting on the records that they've got, and then how is that presented? If you're voting for the other candidate who's not an incumbent, all you have is what they say in their promises to go on. There's no right or wrong. A colleague of mine at the College of Charleston had what he called the flat tire theory of voting behavior. It says that people get up in the morning, they decide to go to the polls and vote. They decided who they're going to vote for, and on their way to the polls, they get a flat tire. They get out, get ready to change the tire, and blame the labor unions that put a cheap tire on their car and vote Republican. They get out and get mad about all those money-grubbing Republicans trying to take money away, so they go and vote Democrat, or they say to heck with it and go back home and don't vote at all. So the science of elections is great for predicting across the board, but predicting any one individual's behavior is difficult, if not impossible. One of the challenges that we've come up with, and President Trump was brilliant in his use of this kind of data in his previous run for election. And some of you may have seen or heard about Cambridge Analytics. which was a data outfit in England. And what they're able to do is use something called micro-targeting. If you remember from your bad old days of high school math, Venn diagrams, which were a series of overlying circles, and each circle represented a different interest group. And so the Venn diagram shows you where they interact. Text as an example. So for instance, micro-targeting means I want to know all people in National Rifle Association. That becomes one big circle. And I want to know how many women there are. And then you draw a circle next to it, and then it'll overlap that shows the number of women who are NRA members. And then you want to have how many are over 25. And then so you come down to a very, very small number of people that you can target your advertising and your marketing to. And if you're interested in a brilliant use of that, there are a couple Netflix documentaries talking about Cambridge Analytics and how effective they were in the micro-targeting. And the other challenge that's coming up for elections and for parties is artificial intelligence. In the idea of personalizing letters, it gives you immense flexibility in doing that. Perhaps more challenging is use of deep fakes, the ability of artificial intelligence to recreate the likeness and voice of an individual. And YouTube, among other platforms, is full of examples of deep fakes. And how do you know what's being said? And that gets to be an issue of what's going on somewhat in the war in Ukraine, whose information is correct. And because it's used in not always an above board, honest way, and you're not told that it's not genuine, it can really play a role in manipulating the outcome of elections. And then we get into this whole debate over what's truth and what do I believe. And it tends to be the point, the less we know, the more comfortable we are that we're right. And we only tend to look at responses that tend to support what I already believe. And one of the major proponents of this, although not their direct intention, but indirectly has this effect, is social media. They make their money by selling you. They make their money by getting you to look at ads, to spend time, to go down rabbit holes. And they have found that if I send you stuff that you like, you're more likely to look at it. So if you ever found out, you go online and doing some research on hiking boots, and the next day you get an advertisement for the best hiking boots around, that's the way they're structured. That's the way they're designed. And so they're designed to get people to spend time looking at ads, reading articles, reading blogs. And they have found that if they show you things you believe, you're more likely to look at it and the more money they make. I did a class on this 2 years ago, and the motto that I had during that time was acceptance without reflection is dangerous. Look at the big rumor going around through social media, among others, and this ties into public opinion and voting, of the child sex ring being run out of a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor in the basement. And you could call up, and based on the kind of pizza you ordered is the kind of child you're looking for. Interesting. And of course, this is being run by Democrats, Democrat donors. And ultimately, a fellow showed up outside the pizza parlor with an AR-15, wanted to go and investigate it. And when he was arrested, what did the proponents of the rumor say? Well, he was a crisis actor paid to make us look bad. Well, the reality is there was not even a basement to the pizza parlor. But it's one of these things that got started, it supported people's beliefs, and it became a rumor that had an impact. And those are the challenges, especially the younger generations, your generation and Generation Alpha, those coming along born after 2010, is this instantaneous access to information. But guess what? Some of it's wrong. People will manipulate and use things to get things started and what goes on, rumors that get started. And if we don't have that willingness, more so than the ability, but the willingness to look under the covers, it's very easy to manipulate people using social media and what goes on, and artificial intelligence makes it that much worse. Then that comes back to this idea is then what do we believe and what makes us have those beliefs? And then we get this idea of fake news, and we tend to believe news that supports our view as genuine news, and news that doesn't support our group, our interest, and obviously is fake news. Those are the challenges that are out there that have to do with public opinion, with campaigns, with elections. Big role, to what extent Russia played a role. And the problem is, we all know with the deep web and other kinds of activities, it's very difficult to track folks down, to see who's actually doing what. Again, all the more reason that what we need to do as citizens is be informed consumers of public opinion. Be informed of consumers, look at various sources. I look at 2 or 3 different news channels just to get different perspective. I subscribe to a couple different newspapers just to get a different perspective. And I, from a personal point, do not respond to any political commentary on Facebook, because all it does is open you up to all the trolls out there running through and inundate you with stuff. That's the environment in which we live. So for all the benefits it offers, it's also a challenge that has to do with public opinion, with campaigning, with elections. It moves into the final area, which is the idea of political communication in the media. UTEX has a really great discussion about the evolution of media. And very, very basically, it all started out with things as an oral tradition. We would say things and it would pass down from generation to generation. And oftentimes that would be distorted over the years because words would assume different meaning and things of that nature. And then somebody decided, hey, maybe we need some way to record this. So they started putting it down with an alphabet. So you then had some record of what was going on. But so it's very few people could actually read or write at the time and carry around those clay tablets, and using a chisel to write wasn't something everyday people would do. They still relied on someone with knowledge of the vocabulary, someone with the ability to read it to them. And in American history and more contemporary eras, the 2 things that were going on that was interesting is, one, you would have news readers, people who would go to major cities, get newspapers and travel out in the rural areas and read the newspaper clippings to people because they couldn't read. Obviously, there was a bias built in because what they decided to read made a difference. And then when the printing press came along, printed documents became much more available to folks. And so Gutenberg's press came along. We started having that the common man could now have access to relatively inexpensive paper copies of other writings. Then that began to spread. And as literacy increased, people began more and more reading these things. And the early history of America had to do with the penny press. We were great pamphleteers, and everybody with a printing press, painting out for a penny information on their perspective, their opinions. Early 1900s, things changed when we developed the radio, and that became quite popular, especially during World War II. Franklin Roosevelt had his fireside chats. And your text has the numerous pictures of people sitting around the old radios, listening to the president talk about what's going on, and that comforting voice that Roosevelt had. And Roosevelt's an interesting way to look at the way our media has changed. Franklin Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. You'd had oftentimes, or seldom, you actually see him photographed in the wheelchair. Especially in a time of war, that would portray a sign of weakness. Another impact that we see with the role of media was when television came along in the mid 1900s. We then had a way to not only hear, but to see. Where that became important is 1960 debate between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy, first televised debate. So millions of people were able to watch the debates to see what happened. Well, according to the pundits, Kennedy won the debate because he looked more comfortable. He looked more like one of us. Richard Nixon was sweaty, was nervous, was not a pretty picture. And yet, if you look at the facts, Nixon dominated the debate based on facts, but lost because of public perception and the role of the media. And then we go forward and we see how our picture, Mike Dukakis, former governor of Massachusetts, was running for president. And somebody said it'd be a good idea for him to get in a tank and put a helmet on, show he was strong supporter of the military. Except the helmet they gave him was much too big. And when the pictures came out, his little head inside the big helmet, like a bobblehead, didn't do well. Another candidate had the misfortune of using a directional mic, which basically only picks up the sound directly in front of it, and was screaming about where they were going next. Well, that was what the microphone was designed to do, but it was packaged in such a way that it looked like he was off the deep end, and his candidacy soon ended. So that transition from word of mouth to oral tradition to written tradition, then to radio, then to television, leads us to where we are today with social media. Everybody with a telephone is now a journalist. And there is a body of literature called coercive self-censorship. And what it suggests is that people are less willing to express their opinions. Faculty are less likely to want to talk about controversial subjects because anybody with a phone can post it on social media and can make it out of context. Major way. It's also changed the way candidates communicate with their followers. And you had a great example of that when President Trump was in office, his use of social media, tweeting out every day comments about this, that, and the other that's taking place. Well, is that an official statement by the president? Does that have policy implication? Or is it just somebody like one of us stating their opinion? Does it make a difference if I say something stupid or if the president of the United States says something stupid? Perception, position, all those things get to be different. And again, Netflix has a couple wonderful, wonderful videos about the role of social media and how it's structured. And we see the massive changes that it's had with the way we campaign, with the way candidates run for office. Now it's seldom, if ever, you have a candidate that doesn't have their own webpage, doesn't have their own blog, doesn't have other ways to take advantage of media. And all that's going to change. Sophistication comes along, and is artificial intelligence becomes a way of the future, not only from communication, but also the ability to distort the news. The other thing to keep in mind is every news outlet has its own bias. And that bias comes about with the decision of what their report is being the news. And the purpose of the news media isn't necessarily to share all the news and spit the print. It's to get money from advertisers. So they're going to highlight those stories that tend to have more viewers, which then get more eyes on the commercials. And I use as an example, why is it that an attractive white woman goes missing in a trip with her boyfriend, and it's covered in the news for weeks? And yet every day we have minorities and others across the country who go missing. And when's the last time you saw them on TV? Why did that one case get so much attention and others don't? That reflects a bias because that's what their guess is more people are willing to watch. And then that becomes kind of the subtle bias of just getting viewership. And then you have more that are directly biased in what they say. And we're getting to the point now with so much of the stuff, it's opinion being marketed as fact. It's opinion being marketed as news. And everybody has an opinion, we're all entitled to them. But to what extent are we forced to defend them with defensible facts? That's why in my classes, your opinion is your own. I judge you based on how well you can defend it. Last time I was teaching a class on elections, one of the students in class jumped up and said, there are X million illegal votes in California. Fine, how do you know that? Well, I heard it from somebody else. How did they know it? Well, we don't validate them. We don't go back to make sure they're accurate. And pretty soon rumors go all around the place and have no basis in fact. And then, Andrew, your mic is open. So if you don't want, if you please mute unless you have a question. Or do you have a question?
No, sir. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. So those get to be the challenges with this process, and it's going to be more and more complex. Campaigns are going to become more sophisticated in using them. The news media will become more sophisticated in the way they're used, and those who have somewhat nefarious means and directions will find more ways to take advantage of them and us to try to manipulate what we believe and how we vote. The challenges are out there, and so that's what the new media and that whole discussion in your text when they talk about new media. is about the increased role of social media in the process as you go forward. And that gets to be an important part of what we do. Any questions? Makes sense what we're doing? Yes, I have a yes from the audience here in the classroom, so I'll take that as a yes if we've got other questions. But again, kind of a brief overview of what we're talking about. Lots of information grouped together in a small amount of time. As always, if you have questions, email me. I try to respond as quickly as I can to emails. I check mine at least once, sometimes twice a day, to get back with you. As I said earlier, I will check on the status of the grades. And if there's, I'll send out an email. It may be that I posted them and it hasn't been put up into Wolfden at large. I don't know the status, but I'll check into those things and let you know later on this morning on what's going on. So again, this will be our last official Zoom meeting. I will send out an ad for next Tuesday for anybody that wants to log in and have questions about the 2 writing assignments. In the meantime, if you have questions about the assignments, by all means, email me, let me know. And I guess the other point on that is don't wait until the last minute. You know, at this point, you've had at least 2 weeks to start working on those other 2 or the other civic engagement. And you should be well along in your process of going forward. And that's important. Questions, comments? Happy campers?
Yeah, I'll send you an email when I see the grades in the grade book to let you know that it worked.
They are there now? It's under coursework is where they will be.
Yeah, they're not on there now. When I see them later, like I'll let you know that it's on there.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Yanana, because I'll go back and check. One of the things that I don't use during the semester is a grade book. And the reason I don't use grade book is because part of your grade is based on improvement. If you do poorly on the first discussion form and do better on the next 2, then that first one will count less when I calculate the grade. And there's not a decent rubric that allows us to do that. And so that's why the best way to check your progress is to look at each assignment in coursework and follow the grades there. Will make you much more aware of what's going on to take it from that point. Make sense? Okay, well, if nothing else, have a good week. I look forward to reading your comments on your discussion forum, and we'll have a good week and talk to you as you need. And if you want to, I'll, like I say, will be available next Tuesday.
All right, have a good one.
Okay, thanks a lot. Have a good day.